Hello guys, welcome to this series. In our previous video we talked about components, and in this video we're going to see how components really works, how we can create components and how we can use them to create a complex user interface. Just a recap of what we did in our last class. We said React components are reusable piece of code that represents a user interface element such as button, form, or even list. They can contain other components, making it easy to build complex user interfaces. So we mean a component can have another component as a child of it, and it can have another component. So it's basically called nested components. You can have nested components to make a user interface more complex. So this is basically what a component looks like. So components are JavaScript functions, and these functions receives object of properties, and these object of properties are basically called props, right? The props are received in the property. If you look at the example we have here, we have the child component component, which is basically a JavaScript function, and this function accepts an object property. The object property, we have the property of the name and the age, and what this function basically returns is our JSX. We talked about JSX in our previous video. If you look at this, the function is just returning a HTML element that is saying variable name is age years old, right? This is just basically a JSX, and we talked about how to render a JavaScript in a JSX. So this is basic example of what a component is. A component is just a JavaScript function. So we're going over to our code editor. We're going to see how to create these components and how to use them all over our application. So here we are in our code editor. Remember my editor, I'm using Cursor, you can check them out, right? And we are in the app.js. In our app.js, if you look at this, we created this application in our previous video, and we explained what each of these folders and this file does. So we're just basically I'm going to show this. If you look at this, we have application running already. We have Vite plus React, which is what we have here, Vite plus React. So I'm going to basically take out everything in this component, in this app.jsx, and we're going to basically create a new component and see how they work, right? I'm going to do all of this. I'm going to take out this, and I'm going to have only the React imported. If I save this, I go back, you see we have basically empty or blank page. So back to our code editor. So since we said components are just JavaScript functions, so we're going to create a function. We're going to create a component called greet. So I'm just going to say function greet, which is going to return a JSX, which is going to say paragraph tag, which is going to say p, say hello, welcome to our series. So this is basically what a component looks like. But if I save this and I go back to my browser and I reload, nothing happens. This is because if a component is as good as useless until it is being used in our application. So how do we use this function? We use this function by calling this function as a component, as a tag in our application. So we do that by just saying greet, and it becomes a self-closing tag. Greet. This is supposed to be greet, right? So it becomes a self-closing tag. So if I save this and I go back to my editor to run, you see this becomes, you're going to see this, hello, welcome to our series. So this is the simplest example of a component and how to create a component and how to use them in our web application. So now, since we've learned how to create basic components and how to use them, let's see how we can create a component outside our application. Remember we said components are reusable piece of code. Let's see how we can create a component outside our app component, which is in our app.js. Let's see how we can export them, and let's also see how we can import components. So we're going to check out exporting and importing components. So how do we do that? We first of all create a folder in our source folder called components, and inside our folder we're going to create a file. I'm going to create a file called greet.js. So this is going to be a component that will greet all my users, right? So how do we do that? There are two ways to export a component. We have the first method of exporting a component is by exporting the name of the component. So first is it's called the name export, and secondly we have the default export. We're going to demonstrate how all of those work. First of all, we're going to try our name export and see how we can also import that in our app.jsx. So I'm going to create a function here. I'm going to create a function and I'm going to call it greet me, right? I'm going to call it greet me, and I'm going to return just a paragraph tag, and I'm saying hello, this function is a component that will just greet me, right? Don't worry about my long message. I just love doing that. So we've created this component greet me, right? We are going to export this component using the name export method. So all I'm going to do is to say export this, right? When I export this, you will see that I'm exporting only this function name. I'm exporting only this function name. So how do we import components in our main pages? All I'm going to do is to say, I'm going to use the import keyword. I'm going to say import greet me. Greet me is the name of the component I created, and I'm going to say from. Now I'm going to specify where I'm importing this component from. I'm going back to my component folder and I'm going back to the greet file, right? So let me explain this. I'm using the import keyword and I'm importing a component called greet me from component greet. So how do I use this now? That means I'm going to take out this we created before, and I'm going to replace this with greet me, right? So you see, this is now in our browser. Say hello, this function is a component that will greet me, because that is what we have here. So we created this and we exported this as hello, as greet me component. So, and we say this is an example of name export. Now we're going to see how to use the default export to create a component and see how to use them. So I'm going to create a new component. I'm going to say default export, right? So I'm going to say export default function greet me again, right? I'm going to create this and I'm going to return a paragraph element, and I'm saying this is another greeting. If I save this and I go over to my app.jsx and I come here to say another greeting, or what is the name of the component is called greet me, right? If I come here to say greet me again and I do this, take note of this, I imported greet me and greet me again and I used it here. If I go back to our browser, this is what we have this is another greeting. But pay attention to the import method, right? The first greet me was destructured because it was imported, it used a name export, right? And the second greet me again was not destructured because it used a default export. So you see the difference between the name export and the default export. So another thing I would want to demonstrate for us is to use the arrow method to create a component. So how do we do that? I'm going to use my name export in this case. I'm just going to say export function. No, I'm going to say export const arrow greeting. Don't mind my naming, right? So I'm saying export const arrow greeting. So this is supposed to be const, please. This is supposed to be const const arrow greeting equal to this, and I'm going to have my right. So this is a basic syntax for the arrow function, and I'm basically going to return a bold element, and I say hello, I'm using arrow function for this greeting. for this greeting, right? If I save this, of course, I will need to go and import it in my app.js JSX, and I'm going to say arrow greeting import, right? You see, it imported arrow greeting as a destructured variable, right? As a destructured variable, because it was it used a name export. So if I save this and go back to my editor, you're going to see a bold element here say, hello, I'm using arrow function for this greeting. So these are the different methods of creating components and different methods of export and import of components in our application. So we've seen how to create all of these components and different ways to create it. But a question comes to my mind. What if I want to create a component? I want to say export const, right, greet with props, right? So I'm going to say export actual greeting, and I'm going to say actual greeting return hello, and I want to say hello Paul, right? I want to say hello Paul. If I do this and I import this in my app.js, right, and I import actual if I do this and I import my actual greeting, right, if I do this and I import my actual greeting, I'm going to say actual greeting. If I save this, this is what I have, and I want to, if I duplicate this and I still have the same thing, but in this case I want to say hello Paul, and I'm in the next greeting I want to say hello John, because we said components are reusable. So that means I only have to create one component and I can reuse them anywhere I go. So how do I change these values? How do I make these values dynamic? So this brings us to what is called props. So in our next video, we're going to talk about props, how to use props, how to pass props between pages, and how to pass props in our components and also use them in our rendering page. So guys, that is it for this video. A recap of what we did. We talked about creating components, talked about exporting components, importing components, and how to use them in our importing page, right? In our next video, we'll talk about props and how to use props to make our components more dynamic. So if you find this very interesting, guys, please don't forget to share, forget to like and comment. See you guys in the next video.